All right, welcome everyone to our Venus retrograde class in Virgo Leo in summer of 2015. As you can see on your screen, Venus is going retrograde shortly, July 25th through September 6th. It turns stationary retrograde at 0 Virgo, 46 minutes, and it goes stationary direct at 14 Leo, 23 minutes. And so before we get started in all of our Venetian details, first of all, a few housekeeping slides. Thank you very much for letting me go through these. Here at EAN, you can study with us 3 different ways: our audio podcast, our Astro Library, and our multimedia course. Here's a little slide on our Astro Library, and in case you're keeping track of the titles and the hours, I know it's out of date. I think it's been a few months since we've added on to it. This is where all of our material eventually ends up in the Astro Library. You can see the 3 different sections. You can subscribe for 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, or do a monthly recurring that you may cancel at any time. Here's our multimedia course, 3 different segments. You can see on your screen some of the materials that it comes with: binders, DVDs, the original transcript of the very first school Jeffrey Wolf Green taught back in the mid-90s, and of course the 250, probably 275 or 300 hours of audio files and webinar files that I have taught through segment 1. And if you are interested, both segment 1 and segment 2 now come completely online, or you can get all of the binders and online access. You can go to our website and look at our I think it's our multimedia page. Our web programmer is in process of changing the website as we speak, just trying to reorganize our materials so they become easier for anybody to find things and study as their interest and expertise level guides them. And of course, if you do subscribe to either segment 1 or 2, we have free monthly webinar classes, and you're welcome to ask for a free class download if you'd like to check it out and see what our monthly classes are like. And so here we are with tonight's subject matter. This is probably one of my favorite retrogrades. While Venus can bring upsets in relationships, both inner and outer, it does seem to be a retrograde cycle that is somewhat smoother than, say, Mars retrograde cycle. I consider Venus retrograde cycles to be quote unquote one of the easiest retrograde cycles, and Mars to be quote unquote one of the hardest retrograde cycles. So even Venus and Mars as a planetary pair operate so differently when they go retrograde. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have upsets. Like I say, I've had the Venus retrograde cycles in the past that have actually brought about those abrupt relationship endings and all the devastation and betrayal that comes through that. So by no means am I saying that does not happen. It can happen. It does happen. But it doesn't happen every time we have a Venus retrograde cycle. The whole purpose of Venus retrograde is learning to know ourselves better. So I wanted to start out and just give you a few of these generic slides that I put in my retrograde classes and do some explaining of planetary retrogrades in general. So the principle of psychological compensation is being out of sync with your own true nature. And most souls have psychological compensations in order to appear normal or be able to get along with others, relate to others. And this can happen regardless of our evolutionary state of consciousness, consensus individuating or spirituating in the world of EA. These psychological compensations take place wherever we have any sense of dissatisfaction. Now we look for that status quo and the kinds of compensations it will bring through any planetary archetype. It's typically the distortions of any planetary archetype. And those clues are going to come via the sign of the planet, the house it's in, the aspects, and then, of course, that evolutionary state of consciousness within our soul, and all of the personal environmental conditionings that we have in our world. So planetary retrogrades offer us opportunity to break free from all of these compensations and conditionings and align with our own individual nature. Now, planetary retrogrades are a geocentric or Earth-centered phenomena of apparent motion. And planetary retrogrades are always a more powerful time for the planet because it's always in a close proximity to Earth whenever it's retrograde. This is true of interior planets, Mercury, Venus, and exterior planets, Mars on out to Pluto and Eris. Planetary retrogrades generally, again, cause a withdrawal from that status quo to redefine that planetary archetype according to our individual natural law. A retrograde planetary archetype is non-static, meaning it's in a perpetual state of evolving, reviewing, becoming, liberating. The sign and the house of a planetary retrograde by transit defines how it's manifesting, and the opposite sign and house provide the clarity and expression. And of course, answers to any planetary retrogrades always come from within ourselves. A few other generic principles to keep in mind. If you are born with any natal planet retrograde, it means that you have this planetary archetype as an individual lesson throughout your lifetime. You're throwing off all of the conditioning factors and distortions of that planetary archetype and trying to find your own definition of that archetype. When we go through a transiting planet retrograde, such as this upcoming Venus retrograde, it means that we are all experiencing it individually during the retrograde cycle, and we are also experiencing it collectively as groups and societies. When we have a natal planet retrograde at birth and it goes retrograde by transit, it creates a temporary harmony and balance. The most common example is if you were born with Mercury retrograde natally, you will most likely have a somewhat easier time when Mercury's retrograde by transit compared to those of us who have Mercury direct in our natal chart. Now, if you're born when any planet is turning retrograde or direct, it's a more powerful state. Everything is more intensified. If you're born when a planet is just getting ready to turn stationary retrograde, or it just has, you are forced into reviewing that archetype. And it can be hard to move that archetype forward in life. You do periodically, but you will feel like you're always in a perpetual state of throwing off all the conditioning factors of that retrograde planet. If you're born when a planet is stationary direct, this is the universe pushing that archetype forward. It means you've spent most recent past lives throwing off conditioning factors to that planetary archetype, and this time around you are ready to make those evolutionary leaps forward. Now, here you are right up front with some of the dates for the Venus retrograde archetype, and I don't think I put that slide in, but I can give you the information because I'm remembering off of the top of my head. Venus in Leo, Venus entered its shadow, Virgo, Venus, oops, I got to turn these two around right there. I didn't catch that little part. Venus is then going to go retrograde and go back into Leo. You can see the highlight of the Venus retrograde cycle right here. We'll speak more to this. Venus direct goes into Virgo, then goes into Libra. The point I wanted to make is that with the Venus retrograde here, it will be in Leo 92 days, if I'm remembering correctly, in Leo, going into Virgo, bouncing back to Leo. Venus will be in Virgo 53 days. These 13 days right here, and then another month as it finishes up the third passage of Venus. So here's the dates of the three passages of Venus from the point it goes retrograde to the point it goes, here's a retrograde point, here's the direct point. And so here's where Venus entered shadow, and up until its retrograde here, July 25th, this is the first passage of Venus. Here's the retrograde passage from July 25th through September 6th when it goes direct at 14 Leo 23. And then here's the third passage that Venus makes from 14.5 Leo all the way to the 046 Virgo again. Essentially, in a nutshell, I always like to put a few of these points together. Venus retrograde in Virgo Leo means reviewing and letting go of judgments, guilt, inferiority, superiority, or ego complexes, false identities, drama extremes, all the love games we can play in relationships, and our childhood attention patterns, meaning our emotional displacement patterning. We'll go into this in more detail as we go through the slides, but I just wanted to give you some little key phrases that you can be pondering and thinking of as we go through all of our slides here. Now, the Venus retrograde polarity will point to Aquarius and then finish up in Pisces as Venus goes direct and moves through Virgo again. So here we have to embrace objective awareness and acceptance of our positions in life, who we uniquely are, fairness with self and others, emotional self-reliance on deepest levels possible, and reconnection with the ultimate resource in love, which is universal source. In other words, we're going to be looking for real, honest, deep self-love, inner self-love. It's always Venus retrograde. It's emphasized when there is a retrograde in Virgo Leo. And we are going to find love reflected back from others to the degree that we find it within ourselves. Back to a little astronomy. Venus has a revolution around the sun that is 225 days. It is less than that calendar year. And with its retrogrades, it makes it seem as though Venus is always traveling more or less with the sun. Its revolution around the zodiac is anywhere from 9 to 14 months out of the year. It is one of the rarest retrograde cycles. Jeffrey used to teach about 10% of the time. I went back and checked some of these retrograde cycles, and it's really more accurately about 7 to 8% of the time that Venus is retrograde in a calendar year. So that is the rarest retrograde cycle. It goes retrograde approximately every 19 months, and its retrograde period is 40 to 43 days. Its stationary period, stationary retrograde, stationary direct, 2 days. It appears to stand still in the sky 2 days when it changes directions, both ends of the spectrum, retrograde and direct. It is retrograde approximately 4 months in one sign with any retrograde period. Now in this case, with 2 signs of the zodiac, it can extend into those 2 signs approximately 5 months. 92 days in Virgo, 92 days in Leo, 52 days in Virgo. Every 8 years, though, we have 5 Venus retrograde cycles, and they make a 5-pointed star in the circle or the zodiac, known as the pentagram. This is why Venus is another symbol for the pentagram, which is dividing the circle by 5. Now, each point in this retrograde cycle occurs 2 to 3 days earlier and 2 to 3 degrees earlier each time it repeats in one of those 5 points. I'll show you this visually in the next slide. So we have a 104-year cycle in which Venus reverses through one of the signs on each point of the pentagram. So let me show you this a little bit differently. And here's pictures of Kim Marie when she used to be a dancer. I left this in from the last time I did a Venus retrograde class. Here's how it works visually. The Venus retrograde cycles will go from Aries, Scorpio, Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Virgo, Leo. I'm talking stationary retrograde points here, okay? And then it starts over. Aries, Scorpio, Libra, Gemini, Aquarius, Capricorn, Virgo, Leo, back to Aries. Now, the last time we had Venus stationary retrograde starting through Virgo was 2007, 1999, 91, 1983. This was my divorce out of the blue. 1975, 1967, 59, 51. So yes, those Venus retrogrades can bring some intense dramas. Venus was going retrograde over my natal Pluto in Virgo during this retrograde cycle here. And let me look at it, show it to you here with a little more detail. From 1911 through 2015, every time Venus went retrograde, every 8 years, it started in Virgo. You go back to summer of 1911, Venus went retrograde in Virgo at about 28, 29 degrees Virgo. And now we have it going retrograde between 0 and 1. So for 104 years, every 8 years that Venus went retrograde on this point, it started again 28, 29 degrees Virgo. Then 8 years later, 26, 27 degrees Virgo, all the way to 2015, where it's starting to go retrograde 0, 1 degrees Virgo. So more on this interpretation-wise in a little later. This is concentrating on the astronomy. There's multiple fairy tales that are related to Venus cycles in the sky. And this one, this 104-year cycle, as this 5-pointed star reverses through the zodiac, relates to the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale of the princess falling asleep for 100 years and she must be kissed by the prince before she wakes up. If you want to, you can watch the Disney movies around Venus. There's a new one with Angelina Jolie that looks at the distortions and shadow and brings them into a fuller picture. And you can get some of the deeper symbolisms of these Venus retrograde cycles through the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale. 8 years from now, 2023, the next time Venus goes retrograde, it will go retrograde at 28 Leo, 36 minutes, and will go 104 years from 2023 with Venus every 8 years starting retrogrades in Leo. So this is also significant that we're finishing up Venus retrogrades in Leo initiations and starting Venus retrogrades in Leo. Again, I'll say more on this a little later. Here's some more Venus mythology and astronomy. And I got to give credit here to Daniel Giamario. He is the one with the Shamanic Astrology website who really works with looking at the planetary cycles from how we and our ancestors visually looked at them. There is a 584-day cycle to Venus and its retrograde cycles. And it typically starts out with Venus as a morning star for approximately 8 to 9 months. Remember, 19-month cycle from retrograde to retrograde? It starts with the heliacal rising of Venus during the retrograde cycle. And this is where Venus retrograde moves ahead of the Sun with an interior conjunction from our visual viewpoint. And that Venus heliacal rising sign, which in this case is going to be Leo, rules the next 19-month cycle. And then we will have 7, once in a while 8, Moon-Venus morning conjunctions as Venus rises and then sets in the sky and descends into the underworld. Now, when it's a morning cycle and we have these 7 Moon-Venus conjunctions, they're known as gates or chakras, where Venus is releasing a vestment at each gate. And if you study this mythological cycle, releasing the vestments would be releasing the crown, releasing clothing, releasing anything that Venus in its association with food, clothing, shelter, the finer refinements of art and love and beauty. Venus releases these with each of these conjunctions, and it's known as Venus dying off to the old self and to old associations with self, to old values with self. And what becomes unique when Leo is the heliacal rising, it really is having us let go of any old egoic associations to self, old values to self that we may have. And then when Venus moving direct descends into the underworld, when it's going direct, it is in the underworld for 2 to 3 months. And in the middle of it, it has that exterior conjunction to the Sun. And this is known as death by intent with Venus. This Venus cycle goes back in history in all kinds of different ways of the death and rebirth cycle. And for those of us who know the modern rulerships, Venus ruling Taurus, Pluto, the soul, ruling Scorpio, there's a real planetary pair between Venus and Pluto sitting as rulers of 2 polarities. And you can take it even to Venus's rulership of Libra and the old ruler of Scorpio, which is Mars, Aries. There's the other Venus planetary pair Venus-Mars, and again, death and rebirth of the soul, Venus-Pluto, death and rebirth of love, inwardly, outwardly, Venus-Mars. Now, then when Venus rises from that underworld and becomes an evening star, which also lasts about 8 to 9 months, again, it starts with Venus moving direct and falling behind the sun after the exterior conjunction. Look at what we've had now. Sun sets and Venus is behind the sun. It sets after the sun. That's why we can see Venus visually as an evening star. We will also have 7, once in a while 8, waxing Venus-Moon conjunctions as Venus rises and then sets in the sky and again goes into the underworld. Now, when we have these 7 Moon-Venus conjunctions as an evening star, also known as gates or chakras, this is where Venus gathers back the vestments that she released as a morning star. She gathers those same vestments back up. You know, in the mythology, again, it would be a crown. It would be the staff or you know, ruling staff, whatever. Be clothes, be all the same things she released, she gathers back up. But from spending those 2 to 3 months in the underworld, she now has all these wisdoms when she rebirths and gains her vestments back. So evening star Venus is known as wisdom and insights. But eventually, as we are right now in the cycle, it's going to repeat itself with Venus turning retrograde. And the retrograde means that Venus is getting ready to again throw off and rebirth in a short period of time, whatever the symbologies are from the last time it rose, again, during the last retrograde cycle, heliacal rising. Venus will go to a new point here on the 5-pointed star. Heliacal rising during a retrograde will be in one of those 5, how's it start? 5 signs that we talked about. I'm trying to make a star with my mouse pointer. Don't repeat me. But you see how we have, again, Venus in the shamanic world, which was how we would visually watch it in the skies. Venus was, all the planets were more dramatic during their retrograde cycles because they were closer to Earth and they were brighter. And when Venus would do that fast setting in the sky retrograde and then that fast rise in, as a morning star retrograde, when it reappeared after being in that underground for a week and rose as a morning star, that was always, again, the initiation of the cycle and Venus starting its work with whatever sign it was rising with. So we're actually, because, hold on a second for you. Let me get this right. Oh yeah, remember it was December, January 2013-14. We had Venus going retrograde in Aquarius Capricorn. So we're actually finishing up that 19-month cycle. And because Venus is now going to rise as a morning star retrograde in Leo, we're starting that new 19-month cycle that has the Leonian theme. Now, I have yet to be able to find a good visual of the Venus retrograde cycle and how we would see it. What we've got here is the ability to look at things from both exterior planets and interior planets, whether this be Venus or Mercury. And if you would imagine yourself right here on planet Earth, and you're looking towards the sun, and just think of it right now outside, orientate yourself towards the west, towards the sun. Venus is going to set after the sun. Venus is to your east if you look directly at the sun right now. This is called eastern elongation. Venus can only get 47 degrees beyond the sun from our Earth viewpoint. So from here on Earth, when we look at the sun in the evening sky, there's only 47 degrees of separation between sun and Venus. This is why everybody's born with Venus either in the sign before, the sign of, or the sign after whatever your sun sign is at birth. Now, I was looking for a visual out there onto the heavens, and I'm going to find it with the interior planets. It's easy to see it with the exteriors. It's not with the interiors. I will keep searching for that. However, in my searches, I came across this site, planetfacts.org, and I really like this site. You can just go, I would encourage you, if you need to brush up on a little bit of astronomy, to go look at this site. And you could go Google on the site interior planet aspects, and you'll get this visual. But there also was a nice little YouTube video. Went a little fast. You might have to pause it or watch it more than once. But if you go look for interior planet aspects with the sun, you'll get some good visuals there, and I encourage you to do that. I'm going to take a drink of water here for a moment and move on. I'll put this up for you right away. Just a sec. Now at this point in astrology, in the world of evolutionary astrology, most astrology in general, we look at the archetype of Venus ruling two different signs or houses. When we look at Venus ruling Taurus in the second house, we know this as the inner side of Venus, and the inner comes from the passive polarity. So when we look at Taurus in the second house, we have passive polarity, fixed modality, mode of operation, and the earth element. And when we look at the polarity, modality, element, this is how we start to get the meaning to all of these archetypes of inner Venus. It is the essence of self-acceptance, self-love, self-sex or masturbation, being able to take care of our own needs. It is the survival instinct, food, clothing, shelter. It is resources beyond survival, beauty, art, extravagance in any way when we go beyond that, because we take resources from the bare minimum to survive all the way to the extremes of excess with Taurus in the second house. We also learn to see self as a resource here, meaning what talents do we possess within ourselves or we evolve with that can become resources to create things in our life, whether it's accumulating money or stuff or shelter to live in. This is where we learn to create and achieve resources in a variety of ways. Now, this is where we have to find self-reliance, and it starts with the essence of finding it physically. If we don't find it physically, we don't survive. The body doesn't survive. But self-reliance from the inner side of Venus, Taurus second house, also includes emotional, mental, and spiritual self-reliance as well. This archetype is where we get in touch with values and essential needs. This is going to be relative to our evolutionary state of consciousness. One of the things that EA would always say about Taurus in the second house is consensus Taurus wants the BMW, it wants the bag of coins or the big bank account, it wants the house and all the excess of clothes and stuff. Individuating Taurus is where we really do learn to see ourselves as our own ultimate resource. Spirituating Taurus is where we learn to see source energy, God, Goddess, Great Spirit, as the ultimate resource. So values and essential needs will be different depending upon our evolutionary state of consciousness and also the environmental conditionings we were born into. This archetype will also relate to some of the physical senses. It can broadly relate to all 5 senses, but it has unique relationship with touch, earth element, with smell, with taste, earth element. The inner side of Venus, Taurus second house, will relate to the pheromones, that sense of smell, or the nose. And this is how we used to choose our partners in natural law. Some of the distortions that you'll find with this archetype: hoarding, stubbornness, possessiveness, indulgence, poverty. I didn't spell that word right. I will make a note to change that. Prostitution, isolation, being very materialistic. There's probably a few more words, but you get the point. Now, here is Venus's other planetary rulership, Libra and the 7th house. And we call it the outer Venus because it is the active polarity here. Cardinal modality, mode of operation, and air element. By the way, if you are new to astrology in general, last fall we did a series on the 3 modalities and the 4 elements with the 2 polarities thrown in. It was a 7-set series, and it's good beginner's material if you want to get down to some of the basic archetypes of these second harmonic, third harmonic, fourth harmonic. Circle divided by 2 polarities. Circle divided by 3, the 4 modalities. Circle divided by 4. Did I say that right? Circle divided by 3, 4 elements. But the outer side of Venus is where we start to look to relativity or relationships outside of self. Taurus side, inner side of Venus, is all about relationship with self. Libra side of Venus is relationships outside of self. And because Libra initiates the second half of the zodiac, one of the essence of archetypes for Libra in the 7th house is that psychology of listening, communications, being able to interact and speak back and forth with another comes from our ability to listen and actually hear what that other person is saying, not only listening to their words literally, but the psychology of understanding the meaning behind the words being stated. And Libra 7th house is going to be relationships in general. And through the diversity of relationships that we have in our life, it bounces back to that polarity, Aries, first house, of leading back to self-knowledge. As we interact with a diversity of people and their diversity of values, beliefs, needs, we learn who we are not, what we want, what we do not want. So again, with Libra, there's relationship diversity that feeds back to an essence of self-knowledge. We learn how to give and receive in fair and equal ways. We learn to give to another as they actually need, and then receive back from them what we actually need when this archetype is operating in its natural expression. Because Libra initiates the second half of the zodiac, there are strong lessons of having fairness and equality in all of the relationship diversity. Now, the distortions: codependency, projections, expectations, idealism, the mask we wear, lack of boundaries, extremism, the philanderer, possessiveness again, neediness can start to come in here. Now, all of this, all these distortions undergo review, throwing off, deconditioning when Venus is retrograde, regardless of the sign, regardless of the house it's transiting through in your chart. And in general, all Venus retrograde cycles must be related back to the natal Venus archetype, which we will know in our chart by sign, house, aspect. So for instance, just think upon where you have natal Venus by sign and house. Give you an example. I have Venus in the middle degrees of Sagittarius in the 11th house. Venus retrograde in Leo will make waning trines to my natal Venus in Sag. So while Venus is retrograding in Leo in my 7th house, doubly emphasizing changing things in relationships, throwing off old relationship patternings, learning to find new relationship equality and fairness, learning to find new ways of relationship giving and receiving. Venus retrograde Leo, my 7th house. It's going to relate back to my natal Venus in Sag 11th house. 11th house, it's going to emphasize the fairness. It's going to emphasize that Aquarian or 11th house objectivity. It's going to emphasize wanting to have Venus and Sag conversations, truth, honesty, honesty with myself, honesty with those that I relate to. Now, you can take where Venus in Leo is and go through all 12 other archetypes, and you're going to have your natal Venus by sign. And it's going to be making an aspect in the 12th harmonic to Venus. And then you can take your natal Venus by house, and whatever house you have Leo, which is Venus's transit, and you can relate it back to the houses as well. And just write down keywords of your natal Venus sign house. Keywords as we're going through. I got them all here on the slides for you. And you can relate that back to natal Venus. And this is how you are going to be evolving your inner Venus, your inner relationship with yourself, and your outer Venus, your outer relationships with others. In general, Venus retrograde, again, new ways of relating to ourselves and others. Status quo patterns are no longer acceptable. All types of relationships undergo change when Venus is retrograde. We're going to have an individual alienation or turning inward. Retrograde planets turn inward. With Venus, we're going to look to discover our own unique evolving values and needs. New levels of self-love, self-acceptance, new levels of self-reliance, evolving our talents, achieving our own resources. If Venus, for instance, is traveling in Leo through the 10th house, can you see how evolving self-reliance could take place in career or taking charge of our life, and some way we've been doing it up to this point no longer works for us? Can you see how our values could be shifting around the accumulation of resources? 10th house. You can just look at Venus and Leo through all 12 natural archetypes and get an understanding of how this is changing for you. Venus retrograde will also bring social alienation. This is the outer side of Venus. We will question how we want to relate to others. We will question how our relationships with others relate to our life. The whole issue of relativity comes up in our world outside of ourselves, and that all goes to changing relationships outside of ourselves, left and right, in a variety of different ways. Collective value systems are re-evaluated. Whatever group or society or country we participate in, again, core value systems on a collective level are going to be re-evaluated. For instance, with this retrograde starting in Virgo, there can be a lot of collective criticisms going on about other people's value systems and how someone else's value system is wrong and our value system is right. And for instance, in consensus world, rarely will we recognize that outpicturing and the judgments therein. And with consensus Venus retrograde in Leo, we could want to push our value systems on another rather than taking the time to reevaluate what needs to change on a collective level with values. Now, distortions in general, the extremes of the Venetian archetype, jealousy, defensiveness, possessiveness, control, neediness or victimization, role inequality, all those distortions of Venetian words can be taking place. When we experience that, what's trying to happen is exposure of these distortions in order to bring them to the light of day and throw them off, heal them, reach for the more natural expressions. So here's some of the key words that I've put together specifically with this Venus retrograde cycle. Now again, this is the last time Venus turns stationary retrograde for the last 104 years in Virgo. It's the last Venus retrograde in Virgo. The next point of that 8-year cycle, 2023, remember Venus turns retrograde in Leo. We're not going to have Venus retrograde cycles in Virgo for several hundred years. So we're bringing to culmination all of the distortions of the Virgo archetype and how it relates to Venus values and needs. So we're going to be reviewing and throwing off critical patterns, self-critical patterns of relating. You know, inner, outer criticism. If we're inwardly critical, we tend to be outwardly critical. It comes back to us that way. We're working to throw off that self-doubt, never being good enough, all of the inferiority complexes that has us manifesting the masochistic or victimization patterns, throwing off rigid standards of right, wrong conduct that create all the conditioned guilt. And these standards come from all of the distorted beliefs, all of the patriarchal conditioning patterns of patriarchal belief systems the last 2,000 years of the Piscean Age. We're throwing off, we're bringing to light with the retrograde, judging our imperfect self against a perfect God, the old man on the white beard and the cloud judging us, and against more perfect others. Again, seeing others as better than us. And so with Virgo, we can get into over analyzing all the different ways we can see ourselves as less than. We're throwing off deep sense of inner aloneness, emptiness, that inner void that we want to fill up with the food, escapism, excuse making, all the patterns that will go through of filling ourselves up in the false ways. We're bringing to light and exposing all of these sadomasochistic distortions in relationships and sexuality. Throwing off a crisis orientation to reality. Throwing off workaholism compensations that we can adopt because of that sense of imperfection or less than. And you're saying, as we look at all of this stuff, and Venus is going retrograde at 1 degree Virgo, and it's only there for 13 days before it goes back into Leo, we're going, wait a minute, it's barely retrograde in Leo. But remember, it is culminating 104 years of Venus retrograde, stationary retrograde points in Virgo. If you go back to, the 200 years before that, when Venus retrograde in Libra back to Virgo, we could be throwing off 200 years of Venus retrogrades in Virgo of some manner. So we're going to throw off partners who demean or hurt us, and we to them. We're going to throw off sacrificing our own needs for the partner. And if we demand that from our partner, they may be coming back at us with that same conversation. We're going to throw off victimization complexes with those associated feelings of powerlessness. Throw off where we, again, abuse our partners due to a lack of self-love within ourselves. Those sexual distortions, including the extremes of S&M. We're going to throw off any denial of sexual identity due to all of the consensus religious distorted beliefs, the separation of spirit of flesh, Garden of Eden myth. Sometimes with Virgo, we just deny that we have any sexuality or sensuality at all to ourself. It is an earth element, Virgo, 6th house. And so if we're in denial of this issue will come up for review. And it will also have us bringing up any abuse around healthy sexual boundaries with giving and receiving. So all this kind of energy can be sparking, especially as Venus turns retrograde. Uranus turns retrograde the day after July 26th. By the way, we have a Uranus retrograde in Aries class 2 days from now, which you can tune into as a 1-2 punch with what we've got going on right here. And then as they bring this stuff up left and right over this next week, 2 weeks, it will culminate with Saturn direct August 1st, 2nd at 28 degrees Scorpio. Now, as Venus retrogrades back into Leo, it can create a backlash to this initiation of Venus retrograde barely in Leo, and especially with this culmination. And that backlash is going to be Leo egocentrism, self-identity, fighting back to be noticed and having our needs met. And how is this going to happen? We're going to review and throw this stuff off as it comes back to us, as Leo goes, wait a minute, what about me? That narcissism that we can do whatever we want in relationships is going to be in our face. Beliefs that others exist to either satisfy or serve us. And if we're on that selfless end, we may have ourselves standing up with others doing that. Goes both directions. Bottomless pit in need for recognition and love. We may act that way, others may act that way, and we're standing up. Again, both directions. Giving from our own personal perspective versus that Aquarian polarity, objectively looking at what someone else actually does need. We can have an egocentric over-identification with respect to our creativity and what we have a right to do or what we can achieve and project out there onto others in our environment, including imposing our will on others, having others impose their will on us. And Venus retrograde, it rears its head and it comes to an issue in our relationships. This can happen not just on an intimate level, but with family, with children, with parents, with coworkers, with bosses, employees, all around the arena. We can have emotional tantrums when we are exposed to limits in life, meaning we might have this egocentric backlash through this Venus retrograde, and yet we're going to have to recognize we can't impose our will in any way we want on others. The universe is going to come back to us and limit us, control us. And that frustration then intensifies those emotional tantrums, and we're not going to get anywhere anyway. We're still going to have to go to that polarity point and be objective and listen. And if this is happening, any childhood emotional displacements in receiving love, in being acknowledged and noticed are going to rear their ugly head one more time for us to acknowledge. And so will possible risk-taking behaviors to be noticed that come from these childhood emotional displacements. Two most famous examples with Venus retrograde in Leo is the good old love affairs. Us going after love affairs, partners going after love affairs. Another example is that good old gambling, whether it would be with resources and having a gambling addiction, or gambling with life. Interestingly enough, Leroy and I have my side of the family coming out for a weekend vacation as Venus turns retrograde. We are all going up to Deadwood. If any of you remember the old Mountain West town of Deadwood, they turned it into a gambling town about 25 years ago. And I have parents, they're not big gamblers, they're social, I guess I'd call them social gamblers. They don't take it to extremes, but they're treating the kids to a weekend in Deadwood while Venus goes retrograde. And I'm prepping for class and I'm going, all right, I'm just going to energize because my folks have 3 daughters. You know, we're all 3 good workers. I'm just going to energize that one or all 3 daughters, son-in-laws, parents, somebody gets lucky in Deadwood this weekend. So Venus retrograde doesn't have to be always a disaster. Stay tuned on the weekly podcast. I'll let you know if somebody got lucky. And the typical people who get lucky in Deadwood are my mother, who has Pluto in the second house at 0 degrees Leo. She won't have the retrograde 3 times because remember, Leo direct at 14. And my husband, who has Sun at 19 Leo and Pluto at 28 degrees Leo. He's going to have Venus in the third house, both of them. He's going to have Venus retrograde over Sun and Pluto 3 times. And in that third house, he's so easy about taking it or leaving it when he goes up to Deadwood. The 3 girls really don't care about gambling. I usually stick my nose in a book or I play my mother's maid and bring her coffee and cookies. I do that with Dad too. I let Leroy do the gambling. So chances are it won't be me, although I might have a chance to read a good book. No, I'm going to be with my 5-year-old niece. We're going to be playing. But I want to just give you a more lighthearted example as we just went through all of these distortions that can be exposing themselves in some way. Now, polarity point. When we are looking at any planetary retrograde, remember, manifestations come through the transit sign and you with your own personal transiting house, and the resolution comes through the opposite sign and the opposite personal transiting house. So as we look at that Venus retrograde with a polarity point in Pisces, any deep inner aloneness, Venus retrograde Virgo, is really going to reflect unresolved spiritual needs. There are no substitutes for universal source. So it's going to point towards the need to create and align with a spiritual system that allows you a direct connection to source energy. And we're going to be doing this in consensus and individuated states with or without a conscious recognition of this. It might come through just as a simple yearning. There's more to my life than this stuff. How do I create deeper meaning in my life? Consensus could say, who will love me, and project it out there onto yearning for a lover. And that's how this is going to be taking place, quite possibly. But this is the deeper energy underneath that yearning for the lover. We are going to be needing to realign ourselves and connect with this spiritual system in a way that can be practiced daily or in every moment. This is where Jeffrey Green would say, the path to perfection is the path of the householder. It's living life. It's not going off to the monastery or convent. This is where I say SMEP, spiritual, mental, emotional, physical. This reconnecting to source energy, polarity point Pisces, is something that, again, we must do every day, every moment, to the point of even taking care of the temple, the body that the soul resides in. Venus retrograde in Virgo can bring up health crises. And the Pisces polarity point is going to point to some spiritual disconnect with source energy that we must reconnect to. We must redefine all of our beliefs, and therefore our beliefs about ourselves, through those principles of compassion, gentleness, giving, serving ourselves, and through that, by extension, others. And that's going to be that mechanism that allows us to release all that guilt and inner, outer criticism that we talked about being exposed through the Venus retrograde in Leo. So look at wherever Venus in Leo is transiting in your chart. Look to the opposite house. That's where, or houses, it may be two, that's where you're going to find Pisces and Aquarius. And so earlier, using that example of, say, we have Venus and Leo in the 10th house, we have planets in the 10th house, the polarity point is going to be the 4th house. So what are our beliefs around love? What are our beliefs around emotional self-reliance? What are our beliefs around honoring ourselves emotionally? Pisces 4th house, it's going to be a double whammy of learning to unconditionally love self. For instance, to go back to the example of Leroy, who has a Sun-Pluto wide conjunction, 1928 degrees, Leo 3rd house, polarity, Pisces Aquarius is 9th house. It's going to point towards Leroy, Pisces 9th house, evolving his beliefs in general, 9th house, and specifically for him. How is he needing to be honoring intuition and allowing it to really step up in consciousness on more and more objective levels, Aquarius, that gives him a realignment with meaning of life and meaning of what he's going through right now. This Venus retrograde, he's feeling a little overloaded with details. Venus Leo 3rd house. In the last few days, his mantra, I need an assistant. I need an assistant. And going, okay, I'm making peace with the details as they're rearing their head, and I'm feeling overwhelmed with the details because it's summer and he wants to be vacationing. And our web programmer lives in the southern hemisphere, and it's fall, winter, and he's going gun-ho on the website. Leroy's having to keep up with the changes. You have to reach over and breathe and have that inner peace and see that larger picture and take care of yourself on a daily level. Got any other comments, Leroy? As you have become my example?
It's just a seasonal thing. It's a seasonal thing. You probably hit the nail on the head.
Yes, we
our resistance to the details is directly proportionate to whether it is the wonderful and temperate summer months or the dead of winter here in South Dakota. So I think that's the bottom line.
Yes, it is.
Let me get in a question for one of our listeners
Sure.
here. What would be the can you generally speak about Venus going retrograde on a natal? That's what you're doing here, and of
Mm-hmm.
course the example is my Pluto sun, but can you, let's just say another example would be Venus retrograde on somebody's Jupiter, for example. Is that
Well,
auspicious, or how would you
well,
read that?
okay, so by transit, we're gonna look at the Venus retrogrades, and I'm trying to keep myself going fast enough and get us in 2 hours. By transit, Venus is making aspects to almost every planet except Neptune. So I've got some key notes on Venus planetary pairs with every other planet here. And so as I go through those examples, and
Yeah,
they're what's
and I don't
coming
want
up
to delay that.
next, as they're
Mhm.
what's coming up next. And so you can relate that then on a very personal level. Anytime Venus is going to have a conjunction over a natal planet, it's going to redefine the values of that planet. It's going to redefine the expression of that planet and what is important, values, importance, priorities of that planetary archetype. And so let me go into them personally as I give example for you in the next slide, next couple of slides. But first of all, I got to get through this slide, okay? So when the Venus retrograde in Leo points to the polarity Aquarius, here's where we have to learn to be objective about ourself. Venus retrograde in Leo, about love, about life in general, about our relationships. We've got to be able to step outside the immediacy of what's going on for us personally, Venus retrograde in Leo, and just detach from the intensity of that or the upsets or the busyness and just look at it from a more broader perspective. Detachment, objectivity, broadening out, stepping back, and seeing where we fit in the larger cycles of life. We will have to learn how to acknowledge and accept others, both on an intimate level and on a societal level. We have to understand what is important to others, what they value and need. Everybody else is experiencing Venus retrograde in Leo just like we are. We also have to understand on a broader level what society or whatever groups we're participating or operating through. We have to understand what they value and need. And then as Venus is reviewing creativity and how we want to express that, again, we have to find where we fit in. We're having to learn how to give freely to another what they need without any motivation on our part. In other words, that unconditional giving is really a value we're searching for in being able to express ourselves. We also need to search for inner acknowledgement from universal source. When we do that, then we find that unique creative role that we are meant to be evolving towards. And we also look for finding fulfillment from the act of creating rather than who will notice us. Then we become those natural creative dynamos and natural leaders because we've been looking for the inner acknowledgement rather than who can see me. So we've got to learn how to deeply self-love inwardly. And that's the objectivity that Aquarius is trying to bring to us. Then that allows us to be honoring and valuing of the creative principle in everyone, of the creative principle in general, then we're aligning to creativity within ourselves, however it is highest and best for us to do so. So wherever that Aquarius house is by transit in your chart, there's your objectivity. There's where you have to broaden your understanding of it and see it relative to others. Again, with Leroy as an example, with the Aquarius on the 9th house, he's having to step back and see the larger picture, the evolution of the website versus all the details taking place. The role he plays as a teacher in astrology, Aquarius 9th house, with all of the back-end production he does. When we produce these webinars, Kim Marie has all of the work on the front end. Leroy has all of the work on the back end. And so being able to step back and make peace, accept that the cycles ebb and flow. We're not always going to have Venus retrograde in December or January. I told Leroy, the next Venus retrograde will not come in July, August, okay? So you can see, use your own, Aquarius house to say, where do I need to be objective? And then finally, I always put this slide in. Remember, the ultimate Venus retrograde condition is identification with God Goddess, which is the ultimate value. And with Venus having that last retrograde in Virgo, pointing towards the last polarity point in Pisces, this is so true with this retrograde cycle. This is a spiritualization process with this Venus retrograde. Okay, let me see if I can get through. Whoops, one more slide. Also, generically, then I just wanted to say that individuals born between the mid-1940s, that's when Pluto was hanging out 12, 13, 14 degrees Leo, through the end of the 50s, that's when Pluto went from Leo to Virgo, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees. Anybody born between the mid-1940s through the end of the 1950s will have Venus retrograde over natal Pluto anywhere from 1 to 3 times, 1 or 3 times. This is a Venus retrograde over your natal Pluto is where your soul is having a death and rebirth of your values on the deepest levels possible. This is where you are being asked to find deep inner self-reliance. You will have codependencies exposed. You will have distortions around your values exposed. Distortions of how you give and receive in love on a soul level. Distortions around values over resources. Everything we've just spoken about with Leo, with Virgo, will be exposed to the depth of your soul. Wherever your natal Pluto house is will include those exposures on a house level. And Venus retrograde will be pointing towards the Pluto polarity point, your evolutionary intent, where your soul is trying to evolve, Aquarius Pisces in that opposite house. So it will have a possible greater impact if Venus is retrograding back and forth over your natal Pluto. And that was, relative to the question below, all the inner planets as well. So here again, let me see how well I can move through this information. Venus always has one aspect. Well, it has more than one, but we concentrate on the one aspect to the sun when it has its retrograde, and that's the interior conjunction. When Venus lines up between Earth and the Sun. Venus is between Earth and the Sun. This will come August 15th of 2015 when Venus passes back over the Sun at 2239 Leo, 22.5 degrees Leo. Venus-Sun, planetary pair. If you have Venus retrograding over your Sun, if you have Venus opposing or squaring, it's going to be about self-love. The aspect is just going to describe how you are going about it. Your essential needs manifesting into creative self-actualization. Now, when Venus goes back over the Sun, wherever this is taking place, by house, this is a time for maximum insights into the retrograde lessons that are exposing themselves, into whatever those Leonian egocentric distortions are around giving and receiving love, giving and receiving creativity, being acknowledged. The heliacal rising is going to be August 20th at approximately 20 degrees Leo. This is when Venus will first be seen or exposed as a morning star. And Venus will then spend that time period until September 6th, rising faster and faster and faster as a morning star. It's going to rise as a morning star after August 20th, as fast as it sets as an evening star between July 25th and I can't remember, probably disappears from the sky August 11th or 12th, because 7 to 9 days as in the underworld when it's retrograde. When Venus has its retrograde conjunction with the Sun, it's only in the underworld 7 to 8 days. That superior or exterior conjunction is long, again, as we said, 2 to 3 months. So, having the heliacal rising as Leo, the themes, and this is coming from a combination of shamanic astrology and evolutionary astrology. Excuse my burp. This is the time period of the lover. New ways. We're all searching for new ways of giving and receiving love, inwardly, outwardly. Finding our creativity, inwardly, outwardly. Leo is the fullness of life manifesting. So we're all initiating a new 19-month cycle of love in all the many ways we can create it. Again, inwardly, outwardly. And inner always reflects outer. Venus and Mercury always have more than one interaction when they have their retrograde cycles. They dance from conjunctions to sextiles and back. Mercury can be 29 degrees away from the Sun from our Earth geocentric viewpoint. Venus can be 47 degrees away from the Sun. Together, that adds up to a possible extreme of 75 degrees of separation between Venus and the Sun if they're each on different sides from the view of planet Earth. So the biggest aspect we can look at between Mercury, Venus is sextiles. So I put it in here. Here is Mercury waning sextile Venus, waning semi-square, waning semi-sextile. Mercury has a conjunction to Venus during the retrograde 28 Leo. Then it has a waxing semi-sextile as it moves past Venus, and it goes to a waxing semi-square, the 45 degree mark. All of the retrograde aspects take place in Leo. This planetary pair communicating whatever we are learning from our evolving self-love efforts. So if Venus is making aspects to Mercury, this is the key thing right here. And the polarity point, unconditional, Pisces, objective, Aquarius, listening, Mercury, Venus. Distortions, expecting others to make us the center of their universe from our perspective. And of course, we can have others wanting us to be the center of their universe. And back and forth and back and forth and back and forth it'll go. Talk, 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 talk. Here's another visual for you. It's as if we were on Earth looking at the sun. And again, if you're looking at it right now from United States perspective, thank you international listeners, setting sun, we have Venus, this is Mercury, this is Venus, and Venus is to our east. This is why they call, when the planets are in the western sky, eastern elongation. It's a geocentric perspective. Venus got 47 degrees and it's been slowly coming back to less than the 47 degrees, and it's going to go retrograde and then disappear in this conjunction. And then here's where it's going to start rising as the morning star, go up into the sky fairly fast and settle down. Well, no, it's going to come to about right here somewhere. And then it's going to go direct and keep rising as a morning star, western long elongation, and then slowly set. I'm going to find a better visual, you guys, or I'm going to find an astronomer who will make one for me. Venus, Mars. Here's the two aspects that Venus makes retrograde. Jump down to this tidbit. The Venus-Mars cycle is always 24 to 28 months, and there can be anywhere from 1 to 3 conjunctions with a Venus retrograde. And there's typically one opposition when Mars is retrograde, although there could be 1 to 3, because again, Venus is always close to the Sun. So when there's a Mars retrograde and it's opposite the Sun, Venus is always going to be close to the Sun. This year, Mars is direct, traveling with the inner planets, 1 to 3 conjunctions. Look up here. We have 2, all right? We have Venus has been ahead of Mars in a semi-sextile. It's going to make a conjunction retrograde at 15 Leo. It's going to have a second conjunction in early November at 24 Virgo when Venus moves faster than Mars again. Venus-Mars planetary pair, the courage to honor one's own evolving relationship needs. Venus desires Mars. So if you got Venus making aspects to your natal Mars, it's going to revolve around something in this regard. Now Venus-Mars specifically, Leo, Virgo conjunctions, manifesting the self-love, inner love, in order to serve or love another personally, intimately, and to serve or love the greater whole. Society, Aquarius, Pisces. There's going to easily be relationship initiations. The question is Venus reviewing an old karma mate who cycled back around? Or is there a new cycle or relationship starting? Now, if you're already in relationship, the Venus-Mars relationship initiations can be old issues coming up with that mate, karma mate, soulmate, and having to work through that and initiate new relationship patterning. So there can be both. When Venus is retrograde, you can have the old lovers this lifetime recycle back around. Do we start again or do we clean something up? You can have old lovers from past lives come in as new, does it last past the Venus retrograde, or do we clean it up, move on? I mean, the scenarios can be all over the place. It's going to be unique to each of us. I basically tell clients, if somebody new comes in as we're approaching a Venus retrograde, in other words, the shadow and the actual retrograde, and the finishing up shadow after the retrograde, you got to make it past that finishing up shadow before you know whether or not this karma mate is going to last. For instance, let's just take it relative to this Venus retrograde cycle. If you've had a new potential partner come into your life, May, June, as Venus is moving into its shadow on the summer solstice, June 21st, you have to really work it through the next 2-3 months before you're going to know whether or not this is going to be a long-term relationship. It's also quite possible that you can have someone you've been in relationship with for a while. Venus retrograde comes along and it brings the relationship ending. Remember me telling you 1983 Venus retrograde cycle in Leo, Virgo Leo? My first marriage broke up. I had Venus retrograde in Virgo Leo go over my Pluto in Virgo 2 degrees, 8th house, 3 times. My ex left me for my best friend. So it can bring new relationship beginnings. It can bring the relationship endings as well. Venus will make 3 conjunctions to Jupiter. We've been hearing about this. Perhaps it's your natal Jupiter. Perhaps you have Jupiter in Aquarius. You could have Jupiter wherever. This planetary pair, we're going to be reviewing our conscious Jupiter, beliefs Jupiter around love, resources, believing in our ability to manifest and create in that material world. Venus, Jupiter, it's going to require us to find those deepest levels of self-love. Venus, Jupiter, I mean, these are considered 2 benefic planets, meaning 2 positive planets, 2 good luck charm planets. But they're still going to point to deep self-love, Venus retrograde in Leo. And when we do that, then we can learn how to truly honor and love, serve another. Jupiter, Venus, Jupiter, you have to be careful of projecting all that, optimistic energy out there on to the partner. You might be disappointed if you do. We're going to initiate new foundations of understanding about life in general and what we value, and then about our relationships in particular. And the ultimate here would be, especially Leo, Aquarius polarity, would be finding that foundation, understanding, beliefs, Jupiter, of how we can be friends first, lovers following through. When we have a foundation of I always tell people, companionship, friendship, lovers, in that order. And when you have a foundation of friendship, Aquarius polarity, you've got that to fall back on when lovers go through their tangles, which Venus retrograde brings up. For instance, look at the distortions down here. Game playing in love, trauma, drama, Jupiter expanding the distortions. Extremes in risk taking, the gambling, the love affairs, risk taking in work, whatever arena of life that, you know, Venus Leo house is in. And of course, another distortion, who's most important in any relationship? Jupiter and Leo, adding in Venus. Who will love me? Who will love me? How dramatic can I be to get the attention? Can you go for that deep inner self-love first? Venus is going to have 3 waning squares to Saturn. You can see them on your screen here. The first 2 will take place in late Leo. The third one will take place at 2 degrees Virgo. Oh, that's interesting. My Virgo is direct, it's exactly at 155 Virgo. I'm going to have to pay attention to that one. And this is on my wedding anniversary is October 11th. Well, that little detail for me to pay attention to. But here's Venus-Saturn as a planetary pair. Self-responsibility, inner security, inner authority, taking care. This is responsibility of the Saturn. This is Venus on every level. Now, last quarter squares, we're going to have to let go of old intimacy and sexual values, relationship and authority patterns. In other words, in any intimate relationship, we can have 2 people define roles in the relationship. Who gets to be the authority in balancing the checkbook? Sometimes it's 50-50. Sometimes another person has ultimate control of the checkbook. We all have different roles in relationships and define them. Venus last quarter Saturn, they're not working out anymore. The, ultimate could be someone wanting freedom from the relationship. Leo to Scorpio, you're too controlling and confining on me. Venus is getting involved here with the ending of Saturn retrograde in Scorpio. The first last quarter square just took place as first last quarter square just took place as Saturn is slowing down in Scorpio. Venus's retrograde takes place while Saturn is freshly direct. And then finally right here, one more consideration. In Sag, this also could be that freedom from relationships. It could also be the courage to just be deeply honest with yourself and with others, be it that intimate other, be it friends, or be it boss and work environment in some way. And of course, as Saturn's finishing up Scorpio, the distortions are those classic betrayals of trust, abandonment issues, rugs ripped out underneath. These are the 2 retrogrades in Scorpio, the Leo-Scorpio energy together. The acting out to be noticed could come through here. All of the Virgo impurity, sadomasochistic crises could come through, and that need to just really take deeper look at what's going on. Where is the truth between these 2 planets in these last quarter squares? Because there are crises in consciousness. Show me the truth. Show me the truth. If you got any of the Venus-Saturn stuff going on in your chart, just say that. Show me the truth. Because when we have the truth on the broadest levels possible, it lessens the emotional shocks and traumas. Even when the truth's uncomfortable, if we have it, again, it lessens the lies and it lessens and mitigates the exposures and explosions. Venus makes waning, let me get this right. I'm trying to go too fast. Waxing in conjuncts. Waxing in conjuncts. Pisces to Leo. 3 of them with Chiron. You can see here where the Retrograde 1 comes right as Venus is becoming the rising star, heliacal rising as a morning star. Venus Chiron is always about turning any kind of wound, no matter what it is, into self-love. Bottom line between these two. So here we're going to be manifesting the courage to make all of those self-improvements that are necessary, waxing in conjunct, to make the necessary adjustments in the world of love. So we could be revisiting all the wounds. Here's distortions, exposing the egocentric self, waxing in conjunct, and all our self-importance patterns, or exposing others who feel that way, and we one more time feel less than or inferior. So all the love games can be exposed here, and we have to go to that inner self-love. And we have to find that connection of love with source energy. And we have to make peace with wherever we're at in the world of relationships. If we find ourselves being dumped, abandoned, the partner says, I want a divorce, I love somebody else. We can't control how somebody else loves us. The only thing we can control is how we love ourselves. So those inconjunct inner adjustments are where we have to make peace with the wound. Any time we go through rejection, the lesson is self-love. I learned that one the hard way back in 1983 with that Venus retrograde cycle. I had to learn how to love myself. And the key in which I really that's how I found astrology. It was the only thing that made sense for me in all of the chaos that was going on in my world. Venus makes 3 waxing trines to Uranus in Aries. And as you can see here, look at this date again. Right here as Venus becomes that rising star and makes the waxing inconjuncts to Chiron, it's making the waxing trines to Uranus. As a planetary pair, it is all about liberation into who we naturally are. Venus-Uranus is going to blow up any false love, any false sense of self, any false or conditioned value systems. Now, because these are waxing trines, there can be all kinds of creativity bursting forth, to the point that there can be too many ideas that we want to follow through on. I value this, I want that, I value that, I want this. So here you have to honor that Uranian element of repetition to understand the way forward into the future. It could also be possible that we could have multiple potential partners coming through, or a potential triangle coming through in a primary relationship. Potential attraction or temptation, what's there that you need to bring back to the primary relationship? Multiple possibilities with partners. Honesty here, folks. Honesty, honesty, honesty. And probably just really need to have the communications through the Venus retrograde. Non-monogamy is quite complicated to follow through on, regardless of all the glamorization around it. We also could be desiring freedom from any relating confinements or conditions. Again, we might want our freedom entirely from the relationship. We just might want to be freed from the old patterns that we consider confining. Others may want the same from us. Waxing trine, how can we discuss it and communicate it? How can we spark into new ways of relating? So there's this potential to have a fullness of creativity and pleasure making taking place in relationships. These waxing trines, this could be, the conjunctions to Jupiter, the waxing trines to Uranus. This could be potentially a great Venus retrograde for some people. Just really blossoming into new ways to love and create, giving and receiving. The distortions, as you can see here again, the love games, the extremes of risk-taking, and then the shocks that come from the exposures of risk-taking like love affairs, etc. The Venus retrograde cycles have 3 waning sesquisquadrates with Pluto. Now, this is the square and a half, and this is where we're going from full phase to disseminating phase, and 225-degree mark on the 360 circle. So as a planetary pair, Venus-Pluto is about self-reliance on the deepest soul levels. Again, remember Taurus-Scorpio rulerships? And when we're looking at this waning sesquisquadrate, this is where we're forced to make adjustments. The outer world is coming at us, forcing the adjustments in that outer world. It can take place in regards to creativity and career roles and rules changing. It can come through with relationships. And again, remember, all relationships are going to have authority roles, authority figures. There can be conflicts around this on an intimate level and through career. So we're going to be redefining the role through which society demands we participate. In general, in our careers specifically. We're going to redefine our role in relationships as well. And because it's a waning sesquisquadrate, again, we're being pushed into these changes. We don't necessarily want to make these changes. And yet we must, on some level, be accepting of what our roles are. Full phase to disseminating. Disseminating phase is about participating in society. It's about participating in the group, in the relationship. On the 0 to 360-degree circle, 225 degrees, the initiation of the disseminating phase. It is 15 degrees Scorpio in the natural zodiac. So can you see how that can change our role in our intimate relationships? And if not, we're going to go into the distortions of all the trauma, drama games to manipulate others, the betrayals of trust, the abandonments, the rug ripped out, all of that Venus-Pluto stuff when we're not self-reliant on the deepest levels possible. Now, Venus-Neptune, there isn't any aspects. If you have Venus aspecting natal Neptune, it's going to be in general, inner, outer love. And it's going to be finding that inner love within yourself and between you and Source and accepting no substitutes. And what you might have exposed with Venus retrograde over natal Neptune or aspecting Neptune in any way, you can find exposure of false loves, love distortions, love projections, etc. So again, in review, oh, and then I had this one in here, I guess more than once. I forgot that I put it in a couple of times. Just to remind you again, this Venus retrograde will affect the Pluto in Leo and the Pluto in Virgo generations. Half the Pluto in Leos will have the Venus retrograde on their natal Pluto 3 times. Few of them in the mid-40s 1 time. And so you can see here, self-reliance on deepest levels possible. Oh, any and all due dependencies, codependencies, catch my spelling there, will be exposed in order to achieve these deeper levels of self-reliance. Now, finally, to review again, can you see how this Venus retrograde, letting go of judgments, guilt, inferiority, superiority, or ego complexes, false identities, drama extremes, love games, child emotional displacement or detention patterns, Venus retrograde polarity in Aquarius Pisces, embracing objective acceptance of our position in life in the broader scale and scheme of things, reaching fairness with ourselves and others on new ways, embracing emotional Pisces, self-reliance on the deepest levels possible, looking for that reconnection with the ultimate resource in love, universal source. So Venus retrograde, looking for real, honest, deep self-love, and then finding it reflected back from others to the degree that we find it within ourselves. Finally, as always, the ultimate Venus retrograde condition is identification with God Goddess, the ultimate value. All right, I made it in the nick of time, just under the hour. Thank you for allowing me to share so much information with you. I hope that this has been shared clearly enough that you have some examples for yourself. Do I have, in the last few minutes, any comments or questions from the board on anything I may not have discussed with this Venus retrograde cycle?
Just one came in, Kim, that might be relevant and should be pretty easy to answer. If there is a relationship ending during a Venus retrograde, is there not a strong possibility that it can come back together again? Is that accurate or just an impression?
If you have a relationship ending during a Venus retrograde, it could go either way. In my case, it did not come back together. It was time for the Venus retrograde to bring the separation because my Pluto Virgo had so many codependencies and inequalities in the relationship. It is possible that if a relationship is going through an ending during the retrograde, you can get back together when Venus goes direct. It's possible. it's possible you could get back together 8 years later when Venus reaches that same point in the five-pointed star. Just like if a new relationship comes along during Venus retrograde, you've got to wait and see. Does it last beyond Venus retrograde, or was it just a mini karmic meeting to clear things up? So, in other words, what I'm saying, Venus retrograde initiate a new relationship, doesn't last Venus direct. Venus retrograde relationship ends up, gotta wait and see, possible it can restart new ways, new levels, new understandings when Venus is direct. It's going to be unique to each couple and their own chart and their karma and whether or not both parties are willing. If one party is wanting to break free during a Venus retrograde and they are consistently and clearly stating, I'm done. I've tried and tried. I've done as much as I can do. I can't do it anymore. Or my values and needs are changing. I want something else. I want someone else. If they're clearly stating that, then the party on the receiving end had best, Aquarius polarity point, hear this objectively as possible and go back to self-love. You would want to be doing that regardless, because then Venus direct, if the partner came back around and you spent Venus retrograde working on self-love, you're going to be in a much better position to decide whether or not you're interested in taking them back. Other questions? Comments?
Nope, just some appreciation on the board for the webinar. You did a great job, Kim, so we are good to finish.
Well, you can see future classes here. Again, Wednesday, we're going to look at Uranus retrograde in Aries, and I always, have some keywords for personal. I want to try and focus on Uranus 90 degrees past Pluto and this retrograde in Aries and how we are shaking things up collectively. I want to do both. You see classes next month, fall series. 2 more slides, everybody. First of all, just for the... Yes, Leroy?
I just wanted to add that anybody interested in those Neptune or Chiron retrograde and Pisces classes, they are up on the website. The PDF is available for download as you decide to purchase those on the forecasting webinars page.
I left those up because my Pluto Virgo was very pleased with these 2 classes this last month. So if you have anything going on in this area, I did like how the material came together in those 2 classes. Here's the last thing. I put together the chronological list of all of the planetary aspects that came through. Here is the first half, and then here is the second half with that Venus exterior conjunction, if you're interested when that's going to be. So then you've got this listing on your PDFs for all of the Venus retrograde aspects. All right, everyone, thank you very much for tuning in to this class, and I wish you all the best on that journey to the deepest level of self-love during this retrograde. Adios.